Firstborn. As Alexander nears the age of ascension, a mysterious Klingon helps Worf guide him towards the path of a warrior.
We start out with Worf practicing a speech about a boy becoming a warrior when Alexander runs in playing with a friend who hits Worf with a water balloon.
A space water balloon.
Worf sits Alexander down and tries to give him the speech, but he screws it all up, which I thought was pretty funny.
I was surprised Worf didn't murder that other kid for hitting him with the space water balloon.
Yeah, that's true. He probably did it off screen, so we never see that kid again.
And he's lucky he hit Worf. What if he had hit that sweet chair with all the spheres on it?
Or any of the control panels that are literally all over the hallways.
Worf is mad because Alexander told him he'd meet him after school, but Alexander said he forgot.
And he tells Alexander that he's ready to take a test of his warriorness.
Worf pulls out the Klingon candles, that's spelled with a K, and he tells Alexander that when he lights it, he's declaring his intention to become a warrior.
Alexander is hesitant and says he doesn't want to be a Klingon warrior, and he runs out.
Much to Worf's frustration. Later, Picard is running a meeting, discussing rendezvousing with another ship, and they're all discussing what they'll do in their free time while they're waiting.
And Picard mentions to Worf that he can take the time to fix the weapon systems, which I will note never actually happens, but Worf is distracted.
After everyone else leaves, Picard calls Worf back to ask him what's going on, and Worf admits that he's distracted by Alexander and why.
Picard says maybe Alexander needs to spend more time around other Klingons, and he says there's a Klingon festival coming up that Worf can take him to at a nearby outpost. Down on the planet, Worf and Alexander watch a Klingon performance recreating the battles of Molar, a famous Klingon warrior.
Who sounds like a Masters of the Universe villain who makes everyone's teeth rot out. The performer fighting Molar is defeated and asks if anyone present is strong enough to defeat Molar, and Worf answers. And I was impressed. He was able to jump right in there and do the operatic singing and fighting without any rehearsal. Worf gets his ass beat in a fight that's not even real. And when he sings for help, Alexander responds.
He challenges Molar and manages to wound him. And when he goes back to Worf, another Klingon steps in playing Kalis,
spurring Alexander to completely lose his shit.
And while all this is going on, a mysterious Klingon is watching Worf and Alexander. That night, Alexander tries to borrow money from Worf, even though they supposedly don't use money in the future. He says there's a guy who claims to have Molar's mummified head in a box, but unfortunately we don't get to see it.
Worf says it's time to leave, but then they're both confronted by 3 space ruffians.
And the mystery Klingon pops out and helps fight them off. Worf says the mystery Klingon looks familiar, and he identifies himself as Kimtar, an advisor to the House of Moog.
He says he was sent by Kurn to watch over Worf, and Kimtar is played by James Sloyan, who previously played Jarok, the defecting Romulan. Those Romulan spies will stop at nothing.
Worf shows Riker the dagger he recovered and says it is a Duras dagger, and Kimtar says he has information that Lursa and B'Etor were behind the attack.
Riker's irritated that even though Kimtar knew about the attempt, he didn't tell anybody, but Kimtar says it's a Klingon matter. Riker notes that the sisters were on Deep Space Nine a while back, trying to lure us to watch that show too, but Kimtar says that's old news.
Worf talks to Kimtar in his quarters and chastises him for being rude to Riker, but Kimtar says he was acting as a Klingon. He says that Kurn wants to be sure that Alexander will be ready to take his place because he has no heir, but Worf brings up Alexander's lack of interest in Klingon stuff.
Kimtar says that together they can spark Alexander's interest.
Worf lets Kimtar visit Alexander as he's going to bed, and Kimtar talks about how hard it must be being the only Klingon child on the ship. He says Alexander would probably like it on the Klingon homeworld, and that if he becomes a warrior, he won't have to be afraid of anything anymore.
And you will always feel safe, because you will know how to defend yourself.
The next day, Data can't find any clues on where the Duras sisters are, so they call Deep Space Nine and talk to Quark.
Who is of course played by Principal Snyder from Buffy. And for some reason, there's a random woman awkwardly standing in the background of the frame.
Riker uses his powers of persuasion and finds out that the sisters are mining on a Packlet planet, so they head that way. And I didn't think we'd ever hear about the Packlets again, let alone that they have a planet.
Worf, Alexander, and Kimtar go to the holodeck to recreate the ambush from earlier. Alexander says the opponents are too big for him to fight, but Kimtar says other things like skill and observation are more important than size.
After some coaching, Alexander manages to disable one of the attackers, but refuses to kill him.
When the opponent gets up to attack, they freeze the program and ask Alexander why he didn't kill him. And Kimtar says his enemy doesn't care that he let him live. In a real situation, he would be dead,
causing Alexander to run away.
The Enterprise arrives at the planet that the Duras sisters were heading for, and the away team finds an alien named Gorta, who says that he crashed there.
When they mention the sisters' names, they end up in another negotiation session where it's revealed that the sisters abandoned this dude to take the ore they mined to a trader. And this guy gave me real Steve Buscemi vibes. I had to look it up to make sure it wasn't actually him.
In 10 Forward, Kimtar talks to Worf about Alexander.
He says that one day, Alexander will be grateful to Worf for all of the Klingon knowledge he's imparting to him.
Worf says he wants Alexander to honor his mother's wishes, but Kimtar says Alexander is way behind in his fighting abilities and suggests taking him to a Klingon training academy. But Worf says that the Enterprise is Alexander's home and he belongs with his father.
This pisses Kimtar off, and he says he could invoke Klingon law, challenging Worf's ability to raise his son, before storming off.
And I note that no one in the background seemed to react to anything that was going on, even though there were Klingons pounding the counters and yelling at each other.
They're probably used to it. We just saw Worf in there that last episode, all pissed off about the weapons not working.
Later, Kimtar talks to Alexander about Kahless and Morath. And Alexander questions everything and suggests they could have come to an understanding instead of fighting. But Kimtar says that's thinking like a human instead of a Klingon.
He tells Alexander the only way he'll feel that he truly belongs is if he leaves the ship to live with other Klingons. He mentions the training academy and tells him he must leave, and that everything depends on it. Alexander responds by saying Kimtar is just like everyone else, and storms out.
The Enterprise finds the freighter that the Duras sisters were going to trade with, but it doesn't seem to be carrying all the ore. Riker makes a deal to buy the ore that it is carrying, and he has it beamed out into space, and when they blast it, the dust cloud reveals a cloaked Klingon bird of prey.
And he did that very nonchalantly, like it was second nature. But there are other situations where they could have done something like that, transported any of their own stuff and blown it up to make a cloud of dust, but they never do that.
Riker tells Worf to hold the ship in a tractor beam, and they're hailed by the Duras sisters.
When Riker mentions the assassination attempt on Worf, they say they have no idea what he's talking about and agree to beam over, when Riker says he has evidence.
Worf shows them the dagger, but they say it was planted. Kimtar says there's more evidence on the Klingon homeworld, so Riker says they'll head there, and Kimtar leaves to send a message to Kurn.
Before anyone else can leave, the sisters notice that the blade has a marking for one of their sons, who is not yet born, and when they demand to know where the blade came from, Worf says he'll talk to Kimtar.
Kimtar goes to Alexander's room, and is about to shoot him when Worf takes him down.
He's ready to kill him, but Kimtar claims that he is actually Alexander from 40 years in the future.
And I don't see why Worf wouldn't kill him even faster for making something up so ridiculous right there. But he says that's why he looked familiar to Worf earlier.
Worf says if all of that is true, he'll be able to tell him about his mother's death, which he does.
Future Alexander says he met a man who offered him the chance to change the past, and he came back to change himself, but it didn't work, so he decided to kill himself.
Since he can't kill himself, he says everything will turn out like before, and Worf will be assassinated. And because Alexander did not take the path of a warrior, he was too weak to save him.
He says he staged the assassination attempt to scare his younger self into deciding he needed to become a warrior, but everything he tried failed. But Worf says Alexander has shown him that he needs to let his son choose his own path, so things will be different now. And they hug each other, like Klingons always do.
So heartless, man. Michael Dorn's probably just hoping for Alexis out of that whole deal.
The 1995 LS-400 already meets or exceeds all federal impact standards through 1997.
Worf goes to talk to young Alexander, who is practicing with his batleth in the holodeck. Alexander asks about Kimtar, and Worf says it might be a long time before he sees him again. In a mirror. He doesn't say that.
Alexander says they need to train, but Worf says there will be time for training later. And they go to leave the holodeck, turning their back on the two warriors that were surely heading to kill them without mercy.
And also walking off in a different direction than the one Worf came from. So are there multiple exits to the holodeck?
It all rotates around them and shit. All he has to do is say exit, and it will go whoosh. Firstborn. Overall?
After getting some Klingon stuff in Deep Space Nine recently, I was lamenting the fact that we haven't had any of those really good Worf episodes that we used to get in quite a while. I was really hoping this would be one of them, but unfortunately, the Season 7 curse struck again. The majority of this episode, when it was Worf and Kimtar trying to train Alexander, wasn't bad, but it wasn't anything special. The tracking back of the assassination was something that I expected to go somewhere, especially once the Duras sisters came up, but we never even saw what ended up happening with them. How did Worf explain everything to everyone else? Are they still trying to find evidence about that? The very idea of Kimtar turning out to be Alexander wasn't out of place for Star Trek, but the way the episode played out was completely lacking in depth or satisfying in any way, because the twist just came out of nowhere, right at the end of the episode, and the explanation is just brushed off as some guy sent me back in time.
Yeah, that was one of my biggest issues too.
And we still have no particular reason to believe Kimtar. He could have gotten all that information from something else. He could be psychic or something. And Worf accepting that he was Alexander so quickly was not believable at all. And I think that if Kalar's death had impacted Alexander so much, and he was going to try to change the past anyway, it would make more sense for him to try to prevent her death, instead of trying to browbeat himself into becoming a warrior. And I would think it would at least make more sense to reveal the truth to his younger self before just trying to kill himself. It seemed like the episode took some jumps to get to the points that it wanted to get to. I thought the episode was fine up until that reveal, and I don't actually mind how things turned out once the reveal was accepted, and that's in quotation marks, but the time travel angle was just so undeveloped altogether that it makes it really hard to look past. And that's kind of a main point of the episode by the time you get to the end. I gave it a D+.
I gave this one a B-. So we're pretty far apart on this one. We got another episode in this season where a long-lost relative of an officer shows up. Granted, it's a character we know from the future, but it's the same principle. Who's left now? I thought the idea of this episode was interesting, and while the motivation made sense, and the actions made sense for the most part, the thing linking them together was really dumb. I totally agree with you, where I met a dude who told me I could change the past, so I said yes, and now I'm here, was completely glossed over. And speaking of glossing over things, Worf even said, who knows what the hell is going to happen now that you've altered time? And the answer is probably a lot. Where does Kimtar go? What does he do? He's got 40 years of future knowledge, and we've seen he's completely willing to do whatever it takes to alter history. He is a complete wild card in this universe now.
Yeah, I had that question too, because I wondered if he went back into the future, but then the future would all be different.
But I did like the episode overall. It was a spark of creativity in a season full of not great episodes. Initially, Picard said it was cool for the ship to take a quick detour to check out the Klingon outpost, but then they kept following clues across the entire galaxy. Didn't they have some ship they were supposed to meet with or something? One thing I really liked in this episode is the amount of random aliens they ran into, because there are a ton of aliens in the universe, and it makes things a little more realistic for the characters to actually run into some of them on their day-to-day expeditions.
Yeah, I'm just sad we didn't get to see the Packlets.
The real twist is now we've had a former Romulan fake his own death, disguise himself as a Klingon, then claim to be Worf's son from the future to gain his confidence and get all that inside information, and he got away. He just left, and they let him. I look forward to seeing how he totally destroys the Federation from the inside now.
Yeah, because now they think the other Klingons were trying to assassinate Worf. Maybe that'll start a whole new war.
One can only hope.